Okay, and welcome back. So now we're getting into the second part of Regional and Late Gothic. What happens to Gothic in terms of sculpture, book arts, a number of other things. One of the big innovations towards the end of the Gothic, 13th into the 14th century, is this change in Gothic sculpture. We've already taken a look at the portal sculpture and church sculpture, and how that has been integrated into the building, and how this shows this increased naturalism, this increased monumentality. But we're going to see the same thing in independent sculptures, sculptures that were meant to be just freestanding sculptures. And we see an interesting development. We see an increase in naturalism, an increase in monumentality, but we also see a development of portraiture. One of the things that you may have noticed by looking at all of these Gothic works of art or medieval works of art is that the faces tend to look the same. There is not an emphasis on the individual person, but there's instead an emphasis on a typos or a type. And faces don't look like individuals, they look like whatever stereotype they need to represent, or what other trope they need to represent. But we start to see individualized portraiture. We also start to see pathos, this kind of sense of intense emotion, the kind of emotion that we saw entering in the classical and the Hellenistic period. And so we have things like this, for example. This is the Bamberg Rider. This is in Bamberg Cathedral. We're not exactly certain of the identity of this person. He's clearly a king. But notice that the features are very individuated. He is not just your typical kind of sculpture. He is meant to be recognized as an individual. He is seated on a horse. Riding on a horse is what we call an equestrian portrait, and equestrian portraits are something that we know from the classical period in ancient Greece and Rome. And we haven't seen an equestrian portrait this scale in a very long time. Look also at the drapery, how naturalistic it is. So between the face, the drapery, the return of this kind of classical form, a pretty believable horse. He's a little bit small in scale, but we see that there is this move towards greater naturalistic sculpture. One of my favorite examples of this comes from the statues at Naumburg Cathedral in Germany. This is Count Eckhard and his wife, the Countess Uta. This is really great because these things are actually on the interior of the church. And when we look at these characters, first of all, beautiful drapery. Look at how the fingers are beautifully articulated. We have these long fingers. I love how she clutches her cloak up to her chest, and the folds of the drapery are very believable. Same with the Count. He grabs the sword in one hand, but he pulls the sleeve of his cloak up with the other. Very naturalistic gesture. They have full weight. I love how her arm is completely concealed under the cloak, and yet it's revealed by the folds underneath it. So there's this greater monumentality to it. But one of the things I think is most important is the depiction of the faces. When you look at the faces are incredibly individuated. Our Count here has a rather broad face, a hefty set of jowls. This is not a characteristic any middle-aged man would willingly put upon himself unless that was something about how he looked. I also love Uta, how she pulls the cloak up against her cheek, almost in a kind of gesture of awe. She has these very sharp eyebrows. Both of them are looking towards the altar in the church, and both of them are very clearly meant to be portraits of the individuals, not just representations of type. You know, in previous periods, when you did a picture of a king, it just looked like a king. It didn't look like a specific person. But these are clearly meant to represent the persons of Eckhard and Uta. And part of this is this growing middle class that's happening in the High Middle Ages. High Middle Ages was an economic boom time. There was this warm period. The climate was relatively mild. You have census in the Doomsday Book that was recording grapes being grown in England and citrus in France, which indicates that it was a slightly warmer climate, and there was a lot of crops, there was a lot of wealth that was generated from this. And so you have rising merchant and guild classes, which are elevating status, and people wanted to be recognized for that status. When we look at something like this is what we call a donor portrait. Obviously, the Count and Uta here wanted to be recognized. So this is why portraiture becomes important. If you're just funding the work of art, but you don't care if you're recognized as the person funding it, then it doesn't matter if it looks like you or not. It can look like some generic king or saint stereotype. But when you're the one funding it and you want people to know it's you who are funding it and you want to be recognized, portraiture and naturalism become much more important. So there's an economic incentive towards portraiture. You'll notice that these figures are looking towards the altar. They want to connect themselves to the altar in this church so that people recognize them as patrons of the church and as good Christians. It's really kind of a remarkable set of statues. But even in statues that are not deliberately portraitures, we start to see a much more visceral style of representation. The Röntgen Pietà, for example, shows a scene of the dying Christ. And I love that these sculptures retain a lot of the color because medieval sculpture was painted. It was very lively. It was very colorful. Here you see a distraught Mary. The heads are overly large, the bodies are small. There's a kind of cartoon aspect to them, a caricature, but that's to emphasize what you're seeing here. The thing that everybody points out in these paintings and these sculptures is the grotesque nature of them. You see the blood is gushing from the hands and the feet and the side of Christ. Christ is emaciated, broken. His neck is bent back in an unnatural position. Mary is overcome by grief. This is kind of a parallel to the scene of her holding the Christ child. She is, again, the sedia sapientis, the throne of wisdom. She held him when he was a child and now holds him when he's dead. This, again, became a very, very popular theme in the south of Germany. Almost all of these sculptures and these innovative sculptures with this great deal of pathos and psychological content come from the south of Germany. Here's another one that's a little bit more naturalistic, but you get the same sense of it. Look again how emaciated his body is, how gaping the wound is, the blood is there, his head is leaning back, his mouth is open, his eyes are slightly cracked. He's clearly dead. Mary is an old woman. Notice that her brow is furrowed in grief. And then we have this lovely, wonderful drapery before them. This image is a series of images that we commonly call a pietà, which means pity or compassion. This is the story of Christ after he is taken down from the cross, and Mary weeps over the body. We sometimes call these lamentation scenes. But in the German, they have a very specific name, and that's a Vesper build. And to understand what a Vesper build is, we kind of have to understand a thing known as the offices of prayer. So you may have heard that Muslims pray 5 times a day. Well, they're kind of getting off easy because in the medieval world, Christians prayed 9 times a day. There was a very elaborate set of rituals by which Christians had to pray. And as you would get up, you would say these prayers at set times. There was matins, which was usually said at dawn or just before dawn. Then there was lauds, which was said just after dawn. So you have 2 prayers in the morning. Then you have terce, which is said at the 3rd hour of the day. So that'd be around 9 o'clock. Then you would say something at sext, which is the 6th hour of the day, which would be around noonish. And then there was terce, which is something said at the 3rd hour of the day, and then you would say a prayer in the evening, and the name of the evening prayer is Vespers. And then in the later evening, you would say Compline, which is a prayer you'd say usually on your own at night, and then you might get up and say a vigil in the middle of the night, and then there was another prayer that you might say in the middle of the night. Monks started following this regimen as a way to keep themselves on the straight and narrow, but it quickly became a very popular thing for lay Christians to do, and there was a whole series of books published to help them do this that we call Book of Hours. And a Book of Hours is just a book of prayers, and it tells you all the prayers you're supposed to tell throughout the day. There are prayers that you say in the morning, like matins, and then there are prayers that you say at specific times of a person's life, such as offices of the dead. So here's a prayer, here's a person in a coffin. You can see he has a scroll coming up from his hand, beginning the first line of the prayer. And these books would give you cues onto when and how you were supposed to say the prayers. But when and how you're supposed to say these prayers mattered very much. Each prayer was supposed to be a contemplation on a mystery on the life of Christ or the Virgin Mary or the apostles. What do I mean by a mystery? A mystery in the Catholic tradition is a sacred truth that is hard to understand. You can only understand it through meditation and prayer. And so you're supposed to ponder on these mysteries. And these mysteries are taken from the life of Christ and Mary. So let me give you an example. For instance, the prayer in the morning, that is Matins, and this is a prayer for Matins, concentrated on the mystery of the Annunciation. So here we have a scene of the angel Gabriel. There are lilies indicating the presence of the Spirit in Christ. Here is Mary, who, like a good, young woman, is reading her scriptures and praying. And the angel comes, and then you have this script which begins the first line, probably the Magnificat in this case. So the angel is announcing the Annunciation. Well, according to Christian tradition, this event happened early in the morning. So it makes sense that when you got up early in the morning, the image that you were supposed to fixate on, the image that you were supposed to imagine in your meditation and your prayer, the mystery that you were supposed to ponder, was the mystery of the Annunciation. So whatever the saint or the religious figure was doing in their life at that time of day, that is the moment that you were supposed to contemplate that. So Matins and the Annunciation happen in the morning. Vespers happens in the evening. Well, what's happening in the evening? Well, according to Christian tradition, Christ dies around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and that's when he's dead. And so he is taken down off the cross shortly thereafter in the early evening, and then he is taken to the tomb. So Vespers is the prayer that you say where you are to contemplate the dead body of Christ. And so a Vesper build is a Vesper image. It is an image that helps you to contemplate this. So these Book of Hours would have illuminations and illustrations of the various things you were supposed to focus on. But people also had small statues, and most of these statues are small. They're kind of bookend size or a little bit bigger. And these were images that would be in household shrines, private chapels, all kinds of locations where you could contemplate the dead body of Christ. Now, why would you contemplate the dead body of Christ? Well, there's this growing fascination with what was called the substitutionary atonement. This is, Christianity didn't iron out all the wrinkles of how its theology is supposed to work. In fact, it takes centuries for Christianity to figure this out. And some doctrines, like the Immaculate Conception and of Mary and a few other things, don't even become official doctrine in the Catholic Church until 18th, 19th century. It's kind of amazing. So one of these ideas is that, okay, Christians are pondering, how does the atonement work? There are many different theories of how the atonement works, but one of the more popular ones is that there was a one-to-one correlation between Christ's suffering and your sin, that he suffered personally for you. And so all of the suffering that he had was suffering specifically for your sin. So you made Christ suffer, and he accepted that suffering willingly to pay your debt. So this image then makes a lot of sense, and its context makes a lot of sense, because it is there to reinforce to you a sense of penance, a sense of grief, a sense of guilt and shame for what you caused the Savior of the world to do. And so you are to achieve penance by looking on his suffering. So everything in this image reinforces that concept of suffering. I know that Mormons and Protestants sometimes have a hard time with the very graphic, even grotesque images of Christ's death that are common in the Catholic Church. But if you understand it from this context, that it is there to help you work through your grief and your penance, and to focus on what you owe God, then you can understand it. And so this was one of the mysteries that you were supposed to contemplate, and you were specifically supposed to contemplate it in the early evening, because that's when this happened in the life of Christ. It happened, around 4 or 5-ish, just before sunset. And so everything here emphasizes the grief, Mary, this is one of my favorite examples. This one comes from Bohemia, but it's currently in the Cloisters collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And here you see Mary's pursed lips and pensive brow. You know, she is definitely an older woman, and she is definitely feeling grief. She has this very grief-stricken face. She's clearly an older woman, and everything emphasizes this grief. We see the gaping wound of the statue. Again, this statue probably would have been painted. You can even see a little bit of trace of the blood. Emphasis is on the suffering. Notice his emaciated ribs, his shattered frame. The wounds in his hand and his feet are very obvious. I love that there's a sense of imbalance in this. Mary is a small woman. She's not very tall. And Christ is a full-grown man, and she can no longer safely cradle him on her lap like she could when he was a child. Instead, his mouth is open, his head is thrown back, his eyes slightly ajar. He is clearly dead, and she cannot bring him back. Notice that her hand is struggling to support him. All of the motion in this piece is moving to the side. It's a balanced piece. Christ looks like he might slip off of her lap at any moment, that she's just struggling to hold him. And all of the drapery, all of the lines of drapery, her knees are moved this way, her head is moved this way. All of the lines of this composition, this brilliant composition, are emphasizing this sense of imbalance, this sense of loss, that she's just barely clinging on to him, but he's gone. All of this reinforces the sense of grief, the sense of loss, the pain of what's going on here. And it's a beautiful piece. It's beautifully naturalistically rendered, and really gives you this sense of grief. In fact, some of these pieces, Christ is literally falling off of her lap. She's struggling to hold on to him, but she can't because he's falling off of her lap. Here he's right on the precipice of falling off of her lap. All of it, all of this motion, this composition just emphasizes the sense of loss and pain and grief, so that you have something to focus on, so that you can focus your pain and your grief onto Jesus Christ and achieve penance for your own sins, and and repent. And it's all meant to bring you to a sense of repentance. Well, this image should strike you as a little familiar, because this Vesper build is what ultimately becomes the inspiration of one of the most famous works of art in the Renaissance. That is the Pietà by Michelangelo. Now, here's where I really want to stress a couple things about the Middle Ages. We think of the Middle Ages as being unskilled. We think of the Middle Ages as not being terribly naturalistic, as not conveying things realistically. Well, I defy you to look at this drapery, and I defy you to look at this very poignant representation of Mary and her and the anatomy of her emaciated child who's lying dead on her lap, and compare it to Michelangelo and say that this artist is unaccomplished, or that medieval artists lacked a quality of naturalism or a quality to render drapery or human anatomy accurately. That just disappears when you see something like this. It's very clear that the Middle Ages, since the time of Charlemagne really, but especially since the 12th century, have been moving more and more towards the direction of greater naturalism in art, long before the Renaissance ever came along. So we tend to think of the Renaissance as this sharp break that all of a sudden, boom, people rediscover classicism, naturalism, they rediscover, accurate drapery and accurate anatomy. And it's just not true. It's just not true at all. All of that had been rediscovered, in some cases, centuries before, and had been rediscovered in the North, in places like Germany and France. But there is something very different about these two pieces. And one of the things that's so different is that, and remember, I'm a medievalist, I was trained as a medievalist, Michelangelo gets every part of this composition wrong. Now, why do I say Michelangelo gets this wrong? Well, you can see how completely different they are. Same subject matter, same basic pose, same basic intent, a message of grief or compassion, but he misses out on the point of this piece. The point of this piece is a Vesper build, something for you to focus while you're saying your prayers, an image for you to focus on while you're saying your prayers at Vespers. And instead of being an image of grief, it's completely different. And let me point out why. Mary is clearly an older woman with wrinkles and is very clearly in a state of stress. the Mary here is a young woman. This is historically inaccurate and also kind of bizarre, that she's absolutely flawless, and she has a face that's utterly calm and resigned. Instead of grief, she's showing kind of stoic resolve. Okay? Instead of Christ being too big for her lap and perilously balanced and in danger of falling and slipping off, Mary is gigantic. I mean, look at her. You have this very strong pyramid-like composition compared to this imbalanced composition over here. Mary has got a firm hold on it. And just look at Mary. This is Mary's knee, and these are Mary's toes. Compare that to, Christ's body. She's enormous. She's like Hagrid's mom. She's so big. She dwarfs Christ in this image. It's kind of funny. And so instead of Christ being imbalanced, he is very clearly stable and presented that way. And then let's look at the details of Christ himself. Now, I don't have a good detail of his face, but his mouth is not open. His eyes are not kind of half-cocked. The wound in his side is there, but it's nowhere near as emphasized as there. The wounds are very subtle. And of course, Renaissance marbles weren't painted, so this never had the glaring blood. But you can hardly make out the wounds. And in fact, Christ looks pretty good for a dead guy. This Christ here looks really just beaten, emaciated, broken. But Christ here, man, he's looking pretty fit. Looks like he could be an Instagram fitness model. He's done his CrossFit. So that's completely different. So instead of an overall image of grief and pain and loss, something else is going on here. Christ is presented almost in a heroic fashion. And this is where we get the Italian Renaissance. This is where the Italian Renaissance proves it's really different. The inspiration for this piece may have been these Pietà scenes, but Michelangelo was really looking at classical prototypes and classical iconography. And one of those prototypes would have been this concept of hypnos. So I'm sure you've all heard about the story of the Valkyries. The Valkyries are these mythological characters. In addition to popping up in Marvel movies, the Valkyries are the people who carry the heroic dead off the battlefield in Norse mythology. Well, there's a tradition of that as well. There are gods of sleep and death in the Greek tradition that usher the bodies of the heroic dead off of the battlefield. And they are called hypnos and thanatos. There's a whole number of these. And this seems much closer to classical prototypes than it does to the medieval prototype. It's basically the same composition as the medieval prototype, but it emphasizes this heroic fallen warrior. It brings this level of classical humanism to the figure, and it brings a kind of classical historicism to the figure. And it completely reverses the image. Instead of being an image of grief, it's kind of a heroic image. Christ becomes the fallen hero who by his death has accomplished this great goal, but he has tragically fallen. And Mary becomes like Hypnos, a goddess, who displays him in this kind of moment of heroism. You can see it has an entirely different focus and theme. So the reason I love to make this comparison is because it shows that the Renaissance is truly different. It's very, very different. But it's not different in the ways we're always told. We're always told that it's different because, Middle Ages, they didn't have naturalistic or realistic anatomy. They didn't have realistic drapery. They didn't have monumental art. They didn't have this capacity to render emotion or anatomy or realistic human form. And that's all bourgeois. It's all BS. It's not true in the slightest. Middle Ages, clearly by the High Middle Ages, certainly by the time you get to the 13th, 14th century, absolutely had that ability, and I proved it. So what is it that makes the Italian Renaissance different? It's a difference in focus. It's a difference that they lose the emotional kind of religious depth that exists. And quite frankly, I mean, from the perspective of a medievalist, I actually think the Renaissance stuff is a little emotionally shallow. But it is. It's simpler. It looks back to classical prototypes and looks to humanize things. And it pretty much gives you a straight story. Whereas the Middle Ages is far more nuanced. that this thing is meant to function in your daily ritual and in your daily prayers, whereas this is meant to be a really fabulous work of religious art. It doesn't have that kind of ritual focus. It doesn't tie into your daily life. It isn't trying to strive to make you a person who understands the mystery of Christ and thereby achieves a greater union with God. No, it's just extolling the virtues of God in art, which is kind of a neat thing and certainly worthy of merit. But it shows how things really do change. You can see this in other works of art, particularly going back to the 13th century. This is Nicholas Pisano. Nicholas Pisano is this artist from Pisa. That's what his name means. And he was a sculptor, so we've come back to Pisa, and he sculpted this pulpit. So this is a pulpit where someone would give a sermon or a homily after the Mass. And we can see that it is loaded up with classical prototypes. First of all, we have, these are new columns, by the way. These aren't recycled columns, but the columns have acanthus leaves. When we look at the base of it, we have these figures that support the structure. And the figures are classical. This one is obviously meant to represent Daniel in the lion's den, but he looks more like Hercules. Now, his proportions are a little squat, but look at that contrapposto. Look at that, weight shift, at the knee coming forward, the classical pose, the fact that he's a classical nude. When we look at the panels above, the panels show scenes from the life of Mary and Christ. This is the nativity and birth of Christ. Christ getting bathed, got his head knocked off, unfortunately. But when we look at especially the faces of these figures, they look very much like Greco-Roman prototypes. And we see reclining figures in drapery. And we see that these artists are looking at sarcophagi and statuary in Italy, and they are moving towards classicism. But this is still a Gothic object. Notice that it has this trilobed arch. This is a Gothic feature. You can actually see a quatrefoil, a Gothic form of decoration, there in the building in the background. So these are even though these things are amazingly carved and beautifully carved, and look much more like their classical prototypes, they remain products of the Middle Ages, and we should regard them as products of the Middle Ages. Well, one of the things we haven't talked about are manuscripts. There is a rich tradition of manuscripts going into the Gothic period, and so manuscript studies has its own kind of lingo. So I thought I would help you out with some of that lingo. If you're very interested in this, Michelle Brown is a scholar that studies manuscripts, and she does a really great little book about the terminology and understanding medieval manuscripts, how they work and how they fit together. One thing you have to realize is that we don't number pages quite the same way that we do in modern books. In modern books, we number them consecutively. So the front is 1 and the back is 2. But in manuscript studies, each individual page is called a folio, and it has a back and a front, a verso and a recto, and so therefore that's how you refer to it. It has a front and a back. And then you have a historiated capital. This is a common form of illumination. People think that illumination means gilding. A lot of illumination is gilded, and you can clearly see the gilding here, but not everything. Any illumination just refers to any illustration in a manuscript. And in fact, then we also have marginal scenes and decoration, but any kind of illustration is illumination. There is a huge increase in manuscript production from the 13th century onward. These manuscripts, remember, are made on vellum. Vellum is made out of goat, calf, or sheepskin. So it's very expensive to produce. But again, the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries are times of economic growth, and so therefore we have this huge explosion in animal populations, so we have more skins to produce this. And manuscripts change. Scribes and miniaturists used to be monks and clergy. From the 8th up until the 12th century, most of these books are being produced by monks and clergy, and by professional scribes who are doing this to support the needs of the church and the needs of the monastery. But by the 13th century, we see a whole group of what we think are professionals and professional scriptoriums. These are institutions that are not manned by monks, although some of them are monks. They're manned by professional illustrators and scribes who exist to produce these books. And so we see an increase in literacy among the upper classes and individuals, particularly tradesmen. So if you have wealth and you are accruing wealth, one of the signs of wealth is the ability to own a book, because these books are very expensive to make. They're made out of animal skins, so you have to kill a lot of sheep to make even a simple book. And then they have to be made by hand and illustrated by hand. That labor adds an enormous amount of value. And so you can understand why that's happening as well. But it's also kind of status. To be able to prove that you could read is a kind of status. And there was this wonderful time period where between the 13th and 15th century, books became fashion accessories. And you would actually see people wearing books. Books would have special covers or book bags, and these book bags you could put these book bags and tie them to your belt so everyone could see the book bag. And, oh yes, have you seen my book? And of course that's important, because it means that you not only have the money to afford a book, you have the time to learn how to read. And you're an educated person, and that indicates status. So, today we use the latest or fancy, electronic accessories or iPhones or whatever, but you have to have the latest iteration of the iPhone, which will be obsolete in 6 months anyway. And that's a kind of status symbol. Books were the absolute, indispensable accessory for a lot of rich people. And so you see that you have a growing merchant class, you have these classes, and so you see more and more books being produced. And the explosion of books being produced is really remarkable. You have religious texts like Bibles. One of the more remarkable traditions are these moralizing Bibles, which were richly illustrated. This is a very popular tradition in France, where these are essentially Bible commentaries. Bible is the most important book in the medieval world, and foundational to their ethics, their belief system, etc. So people wanted to know more about it. Bible commentaries continue to be popular, and these commentaries be richly illustrated. This one shows God creating the universe, and so here is God separating the light and the darkness, separating the waters from the firmament, creating the sun and the earth and the plants and the animals. Here's another detail from another one that's very similar. I love how he's using a compass like an architect would to measure out the radius of the universe. And here's this wonderful depiction of the universe being depicted. Notice that the planets are all round. Everything is round. Yeah, nobody thought the world was flat. That was BS. That's BS that they made up in the 18th and 19th century Enlightenment to slander the Middle Ages. Another popular were liturgical texts and musical texts. When you went into church, you had to sing the hymns and the psalms, and so you needed music to invent it. And now, I'm not a musical historian, but we basically owe the Middle Ages for inventing modern musical notation. If you've ever seen musical notation from the Greek or Roman world or earlier, it's baffling. It only makes sense if you're, kind of initiated into it. But it is the Middle Ages that invented these things we call scales and quarter notes and half notes and whole notes, etc. And it started out simply, but we can actually recreate music, and you can sit here and see it, and all the words being played. And these were also illustrated with scenes that came from those, and rich illustrations. These were very popular. There were also scientific and medical treatises that were very, very popular. A lot of classical books had popular editions made. This is a 14th century Dioscurides. Dioscurides wrote a bunch of books on plants and their uses for medicinal purposes, herbal medicine, all kinds of things. And these were very, very popular. One of my favorite objects from the Middle Ages is the Tacuinum. The Tacuinum, and there were many of these written, the Tacuinum were health handbooks. These were some of the first ever self-help books. They taught people how to plant gardens. They taught people how to dye clothes. They taught people how to deal with everything. Relationships. There was nothing that was not considered as part of these. How to live a healthy and a good life. And this is one of my favorite scenes that comes from these. In this case, this is the scene of coitus. And coitus is, of course, the act of sex. And the illustration here shows two people doing the nasty, to use the vernacular. And what I love about this is that the accompanying text for this says that sex was necessary not just for advancing the species, but also for balancing the humors of the body. I love that. The medieval medicine believed that there were these 4 fluids that the body had, which included blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that if you had the improper amounts of any of these things, it would cause disease and sickness. So you had to balance the humors of the body. And so sex was way. So it's kind of interesting. We think of the Middle Ages as being very prudish, being very kind of backward. But here we have descriptions of how to have a successful sex life and the various health benefits of it. They were actually far more open than we imagine. There were also bestiaries and natural histories. I could go into this endlessly. But again, this is a demonstration of how these things represent the medieval mindset. This is a unicorn. And again, in the Middle Ages, there was intense debate about whether the unicorn was real or not. I actually did my dissertation on a 6th century manuscript, and my author says he's never seen one and he doesn't think they exist. So it's kind of fascinating. And if you look at the first descriptions of a unicorn, the monoceros in Greek, it's clear what they're describing is what we would call a rhinoceros. But then how does the modern Western unicorn get invented? Well, it's like a game of telephone. Somebody in India or Africa, the Horn of Africa, described a rhinoceros, and then it just gets modified as it transmits from one book to the other until it becomes this mystical being with a single horn that can cure wounds and etc. But there's also another important thing. In addition to this being a kind of description of the natural world, this is a description of the spiritual world. Because the story of the unicorn is this fierce animal that cannot be hunted. It's deadly, and its horn is lethal, and it cannot be hunted in its natural state. So the only way to kill a unicorn and to obtain its miraculous horn is to get a maiden to lure it in. And if a pure virginal maiden will appear, the unicorn will come and submit to the maiden, and then you can come in and, pull a Voldemort and kill the thing and, keep yourself alive at a terrible cost. Now, this seems like a silly kind of mythological superstition, but it's not, because the unicorn represents Christ. And so Christ is brought into, the world. He's this powerful being, but he's brought into the world by a virgin, by the Virgin Mary, and then he gives his blood freely. He's killed. It's only in this mortal state that he can be killed by evil, but then this great miracle happens because of this. Remember, nothing in the Middle Ages is ever just one level. It's always multiple levels. And I also want to point out that all of these books dramatically change the landscape, that people become accustomed to reading, at least in the upper and middle classes. And this really changes our perspective on the Gutenberg Bible. So you've been told a story your whole life that along comes Gutenberg, this German goldsmith. He invents movable type, which he didn't invent. It was actually invented in Korea several centuries earlier, but let's not go there. He invents movable type, and then he starts printing out Bibles, and then because he starts printing out Bibles, there's this revolution in literacy that happens because of the printing press. Now, I want you to think about this logically. This story is not only not true, it not only can't be true. He's printing up Bibles, and the Bibles create a surge in literacy. Then the question is asked, who's he creating the Bibles for if people aren't reading? And of course that just shows how absurd the idea is. Gutenberg was not printing up Bibles in hoping to encourage people to read. I mean, he was a businessman. He was selling Bibles. He was selling Bibles to people who already could read. And the fact that he is printing Bibles is proof that he was already capitalizing on a pre-existing market. The market had actually accelerated to the point where, he was trying to buy into this market by creating Bibles. So rather than the Gutenberg Bible being a revolutionary moment, it's actually an evolutionary moment. That means he didn't revolutionize literacy. What he did was find a way to make it faster, cheaper, which is what all good capitalists do. That's what he was trying to figure out to do. How do I get this faster, cheaper to people? And he was already capitalizing on an existing market. So the invention of the printing press is just not the beginning of the story of modern literacy in the way that it's always told. It's actually the end of the first part of the story and the beginning of another chapter. And you can tell that when you look at the Gutenberg Bible, because the Gutenberg Bible looks like a handwritten Bible. This beautiful textura or quadrata text is actually a text based on the scribal text. And even though the black stuff here is printed letters, it is made to have the quality of a handwritten text. This, what we would call Gothic or black letter, is actually a text that was invented in the Middle Ages because of its ease of use. Almost all the strokes are little tiny vertical strokes. And that makes it easier for a scribe to write for hours and hours and hours and hours. That's why the script looks the way it does. If you're reading this as a scholar, it tends to all blend together like a barcode, but you do learn on the little tricks to reading it. So that's what was the movable type. That was his innovation. But in every way, this emulates a handwritten book. And in fact, it's still illustrated. All of these illustrations are still done by hand. So he simplified the writing part, but all of these Gutenberg Bibles are still lavishly illustrated with marginal scenes and initial and historiated capitals. So, he just saved a little bit of time. Again, he wasn't revolutionary, he was evolutionary. And then as things accelerate, it just accelerates from there. So don't think of people in the Middle Ages as, kind of ignorant peasants until Gutenberg saved them. They were already moving their way towards education. Gutenberg just made this already existing social movement a little bit easier and a little bit more accessible. If there's a bestseller of the High Middle Ages, it has to be the Book of Hours. We've already talked about these. But prayer books were ubiquitous, and the vast majority of books being produced at this time are going to be prayer books, personal books for individuals. Now, all of this in support of the offices of the prayer. So here is the beginning. You have tables that let you know what days and what hours you should say what prayers. And in the Middle Ages, it's just the reverse from a modern book of prayer. There are still modern books of prayer in the Catholic tradition. I think the tradition is that you read the red and do the black. But I think it's just the opposite in the medieval tradition, that the red tells you what you should do, whether you should pray or etc. or kneel, and the black is what you should say. But I'm not quite certain on that. And so the rubrics, that is the reds texts, give you the important kind of actions to do. And these things are incredibly richly illustrated. Most of them are custom made. This is one that comes from the 15th century, so it's quite late. But they have beautiful illustrations. And you can see that most of them are quite small. These were meant to be carried around. This one shows prayers for the offices of the dead. Therefore, it's why you have the skulls here. The Middle Ages was kind of obsessed with death, particularly after the Black Plague in the 14th century, because there was so much death, and you had to deal with it. But it also has all this beautiful floral decoration, and dragons and snails. Snails are very popular, but flies and other insects, peacocks and birds, all kinds of decoration. And you can see that here. Now, this is where we get into marginal scenes and non-marginal scenes. That is that usually in these Book of Prayers you have a center section with the main illustration. In this case, this is a prayer for Matins, and the scene here is the visitation. So he has Elizabeth on one side and meeting Mary. So I've explained this before. This is where the two meet after Mary has been told she is going to be the mother of Christ, and Elizabeth has she is pregnant with John the Baptist, who leaps in her womb, letting her know that Mary is going to be the mother of Christ. So it's this miraculous moment. And so the center panel is very much focused on the mystery that you're supposed to be praying about, and the text gives you the guide on how you're supposed to pray. But then we have other scenes, and I love this scene down here, This is from the Annunciation from the Hours of Anna of Cleves, who's this very rich woman who paid for this beautiful book of Hours. And you can see that down here we have the Christ child in a kind of little playpen, and then over here is John the Baptist. So what I love is that the scene here gives you a kind of before and after, because Jesus and John the Baptist are cousins. And so therefore, why wouldn't cousins get together and play together? This is not a scene that's known from anything in Scripture. It's a scene that is created right out of the imagination of the artist. And so you'll notice that the margins, because, this is the main panel here, and everything else is in the margins. Anything outside the text or the main panel is the margins. The artist is more free to experiment. And sometimes, boy, they experiment a lot. Notice we have this crazy dragon here, as well as flowers in abundance, but that's not even as crazy as it gets. The 13th century has a lot of images of rabbits. So here we have a 13th century manuscript, and here's a rabbit playing the bagpipes. Here's another 14th century manuscript. This 14th century manuscript, the marginal scenes I have no idea what you would even call these things. They're centaur-ish, but they're not quite centaurs. They're kind of half deer, half human, but then they have strange faces on their backsides, with the upper parts playing harps and lutes. Going back to the 13th century again, snails fighting knights is a common theme. So you have knights in deadly peril of gigantic homicidal snails. You also see rabbits in profusion. Here you have a dog who is a king instructing his dog knights to attack this castle with rabbits, and the rabbits are defending it. And sometimes you just have kind of strange rabbits just, going after people with axes. In fact, you see a lot of this absurd things. And these are all books of Hours. These are all religious books. I want that to be kept very clear. And that's not even as crazy as they get. This scene, you have an individual playing a horn out of his backside. So all of you who remember those images from Monty Python's Quest for the Holy Grail and the murderous rabbits from Quest for the Holy Grail, I bet you never realized those were accurate to the Middle Ages, but they are. And people always ask me, what the bloody heck is going on? Why in a religious book with scripture and psalms and prayers would you have these absurd scenes? And why would you have, snails, which are utterly harmless, becoming these, penultimate foes of knights? Well, for the longest time, people didn't have a good answer for this. A lot of scholars are just absolutely flummoxed, and quite frankly, for a couple centuries there, most medieval scholars treated this whole thing with embarrassment and just pretended that it didn't exist. And the going theory in most cases was, well, you've got a whole workshop of artists working on these things. And obviously there are different artists making the main scenes than there are artists making the marginal scenes. And so the thinking was, then any workshop is going to have a bunch of masters as well as a bunch of apprentices. So therefore you're going to put the apprentices in charge of the margins. They're not as important, so therefore you put them in the margins. So the theory is that these were just younger artists, bored artists, just making up whatever. And that was the kind of thinking, and they just kind of ignored them. But that doesn't really work, because the themes are all so similar. Snails fighting knights is a really popular theme. So are rabbits doing things that rabbits don't normally do. So are things that we would consider to be blasphemous or scatological. And by scatological, I mean literally scatological. You have things like monks offering up a plate of turds to nuns. Or you have nuns picking fruit trees, except the fruit tree doesn't have fruit, it has phalluses. These are really kind of bizarre, grotesque sexual things. This is more than just some bored scriptorium, some bored scribe or illustrator filling up the spaces for a client. They have definite themes. And if you really want to read more about this, you really should read Images on the Edge. It's a fabulous book by Michael Camille. Michael Camille is a scholar who was taken from us too soon. He died at a young age, but he wrote a fabulous book called Images on the Edge, where he argued that no, these are not accidental images, these aren't just ancillary images, but these images relate to the content of the text. And the themes are all themes of inversion. Knights are not threatened by snails. So when you place knights in a position where they're threatened by snails, that's an inversion. That is the world being turned on its head. Same thing with rabbits taking on the roles of men, or when you place a trumpet in your rear instead of where it should go, or nuns and monks doing nasty things in the margins. These are not, the way things should be. These are inversions. And you see this even in other places. In cathedrals, there are things called misericords. Misericords are literally mercy seats. And these are choir stalls. So particularly choir stalls in England. A choir stall in England is where the monks would go and they would chant. And you chant for hours. And most of the time you're standing. Sometimes you get to sit down, and they have these fold-down seats that you can sit down in. But most of the time you're standing. Well, it's very, very hard to stand. Unless you're Russian. I don't know. I mean, the Russians can stand for hours and it doesn't stop them. But no one else can stand for hours like that. So these seats, even when they were folded up, had a little lip on the seat that you could lean back against and take the weight off of your legs. And these mercy seats, these misericords, are carved. But they're carved in scenes of the devil, of acrobatic tumblers, sometimes sexual scenes, sometimes bizarre scenes. And people often wonder, what are these doing in the church? And Michael Camille linked these images together, that they're all images of inversion. That is, the medieval world recognized that the world was a world in balance. That for every good there is a kind of evil, and you can't really squirrel the evil away or lock it aside. It has its place, even as a reminder to do the good. So let's talk about those choir stalls. You're sitting on those misery seats, misericords, those mercy seats, and the point is, you are putting your butt on something. Well, you're not going to carve an image of a saint or the Virgin Mary on something you put your butt on, because your butt is a nasty part. Because, that's the part where you fart and you defecate and other things. So you put an image of the devil, or you put an image of something sinful, so you can rub your hiney on it, so you can show disrespect to it, even when you're doing something religious. There's a sense of balance, there's a sense of appropriateness. Getting back to these books, Michael Camille's theory on these books, then, is that these books are kind of like a rumble strip. Let's face it, reading scriptures or reading, prayer books, it's boring. It is, even in the Middle Ages. And I'm sure that you've all had this experience where you've been reading something, perhaps it was your textbook, and you just drifted off, and you read the whole page, but you have no idea what you read. Okay? And so imagine you're reading one of these prayer books, and as you're reading, you drift off and you see one of these crazy centaur things, or you see one of these things. It's going to act like a rumble strip. It's a kind of dialogue between you and the illustrator. Real illustrator says, "Oh, I caught you. you were drifting off, and I caught you. And as a reward, here's this humorous picture that shows an inversion of the way the world is supposed to be." So instead of showing you the way the world is, it shows you the way the world isn't supposed to be, the inversion of reality, or the inversion of the moral universe, which is why you have homicidal bunnies and people blowing trumpets out of their rear. And so it's kind of a gag it's a dialogue between you and the illustrator. It wakes you up, it makes you laugh, you have this kind of cathartic release, and you're like, okay, now I can go back to studying the sacred parts. And he noticed that this is very, very strictly applied. That in these books, you never see any of these scatological or sexual innuendo in the main part of the text. So the Bible, these books of Bowers are broken up into sacred and profane spaces so that you can get a little bit of a cathartic release, wander over to the margin for a little bit, but then come back to the thing you're supposed to be paying attention on. And this idea is exactly right. These, showing ridiculous rabbits or crazy things, this isn't an accident. These are very deliberate themes being employed very carefully by the artists to redirect your attention to say, hey, look at this crazy, mixed up, upside-down world. Okay, now go back to the thing that you were doing. And all of medieval life is kind of structured like this. We just passed Easter. Well, 40 days before Easter is a period of fasting. It's called Lent. Catholics give, even to this day, Catholics give up something during Lent as a kind of devotion to God. And so if you look at the calendar in the medieval year, every major holiday or feast day has days of celebration or indulgence. And then before that, you have days of fasting and penance. And you can see this in the calendar. Before Christmas, it's Advent. Christmas, you get 12 days of partying and having a good time. The 12 days of Christmas, by the way, are the 12 days after Christmas. It's Christmas and the 12 days after, all the way up to January 5th and the Feast of the Epiphanies. That's the 12 days of Christmas, not the 12 days before. Everybody gets that wrong in the modern world. They've forgotten that. But before that, you had 20 days of Advent, 20 days where you're supposed to concentrate on your spiritual life and on God and fasting. But people in the Middle Ages recognized people got to cut loose sometimes. They got to have fun. And so what's right before Lent? Lent begins on Ash Wednesday. And what's right before Lent? Fat Tuesday. In America, also called Mardi Gras. In other places around the world, it's Carnival. It's a time. It's a party. So it's like, oh crap, this is the last time we get to party before we have to fast and be serious about religion. In fact, if you look at the calendar in January, you have the Feast of Fools, which is on January 6th. That's right after the Feast of the Epiphanies, which is kind of one of the last major religious holidays. So you're supposed to be serious on the religious holiday, but on the next day, you do these absurd things. And at these festivals, you again would see this inversion. You would have a Pope of Fools. A child would be picked out of the crowd and would be declared Pope for a day. It was sometimes called the Pope or King of Misrule, where they would do all of these absurd things. And this is a tradition that goes all the way back to the Roman Empire called Saturnalia, where for a day, slaves would get to be rulers and rulers would get to be slaves. And the message of this kind of inversion is that, we'll invert the table, we'll turn the table upside down every once in a while to give you release and to show you the world and to let you have a fun time. But we're doing it as a counterpoint to the sacred, that the sacred and profane exist in balance, that you know to dedicate yourself to the sacred. And not only does this idea exist in the festival year of feasts and festivals with things like Carnival and Lent and the Feast of Fools and the Pope of Misrule, but it exists even in their prayer books. Quite frankly, I have to say that people in the Middle Ages had a much more balanced life than your average person. Even your average modern person does not have a balanced life where he measures out equal parts spirituality and kind of release. But people in the Middle Ages understood it, and they were not prudes. They were not, kind of constantly stifled. Well, we got to move on, but I do want to mention a couple of other things. We've talked an awful lot about religious imagery, but I really want to concentrate for just a second on the fact that there is secular Gothic, that we do see the Gothic styles move over into secular architecture. So we have this beautiful house of Jacques Coeur. Jacques Coeur was this trader and merchant, and so his house was a very high-style house. And it, too, has these wonderful Gothic elements. You can see it here. It has these crockets and decorations. But my favorite part about this is that it has little balconies, and these balconies have figures that look out and, look down their noses at the people below. Almost in a kind of sneering, smug, self-conscious way. So this is kind of Jacques Coeur kind of making fun of himself. Notice also the little grotesque of the monkey. There are absurdities here. His own crest used the shell because he himself was a pilgrim that went to Santiago de Compostela, if you remember that. And his name, Jacques Coeur, means heart. So his crest in his private little chapel had shells and hearts. So we see that there's a playfulness to the Gothic as well, not just in their margins, etc. One of the best places this shows up is in romance scenes. We have all these beautiful ivory caskets. Now, casket means a coffin in the modern world, but a casket just means a box in the Middle Ages. And these were boxes or things that held cosmetics or jewelry for women. I love this one because this one shows Siege on the Castle of Love. So you have all of these women, the Castle of Maidens. So the Castle of Maidens, homicidal rabbits, and people tooting horns out of their rear. You thought all of those were made up by Monty Python in the Quest for the Holy Grail. Little did you know, those are all medieval themes. Mind blown. You'll never be the same. Anyhow, so you have a castle full of maidens, and you have maidens jousting with knights, but instead of swords, they're using bundles of flowers. Here are knights, jousting with each other. I love this. This is a trebuchet, this military catapult, and they're actually loading it up with flowers. And then you have Cupid shooting down. So there's all these romantic scenes. Here's a mirror back. The mirror back shows a woman hunting. And notice she's not riding side saddle. She's actually astride the horse. Women, particularly wealthy women, elite women, enjoyed hunting and all kinds of activities. What's interesting is that they're supposed to be hunting, but notice that the man is not paying attention to the hunt. That he is, instead trying to woo the maiden that he is with. But notice she has a hunting cap, so she's a little bit more serious. So we end up with this wonderful discussion. Which one of these is the hunter, and which one of these is the hunted? And then, of course, you have servants behind with, whispering and playing music. You also have this scene of a dog attacking a rabbit. The implication that, the man is hunting the woman and she's the rabbit, but she is the one that's displayed as the conscientious hunter whose eye is on the prize and not the man. So maybe the man is the rabbit. Again, this is a theme of inversion. Inversion of the way the thing should be in a playful way. One of my favorite themes of inversion comes from this casket. We see a lot of these caskets with what we call romance scenes. On one side, we have the story of Pyramus and Thisbe, and I don't have time now, but the story of Pyramus and Thisbe is the story of Romeo and Juliet. It's actually an ancient Greek myth, and William Shakespeare doesn't have an original plot. He's never had an original plot. Every single plot he made, he stole from ancient myth. And so here you see the two star-crossed lovers dying on the same sword. They were going to run away together, but Pyramus is scared off by a lion, and his clothes are torn up by a lion. And so, Thisbe's clothes are torn by a lion. And then when she runs away, Pyramus comes and sees the torn clothes and says, "Oh no, my love has been killed by a lion," so he stabs himself with a sword. And then later Thisbe comes back and goes, "Oh no, Pyramus has killed himself." So she hugs him and impales herself on the sword. So they die together. The other more interesting scene, I think, over here is the story of Aristotle and Phyllis. Now, I have a different casket with this same scene. Aristotle is, of course, the Greek philosopher, and you see him here, and he was often regarded in the medieval world as the most intelligent man of the ancient world. And the king here, who is depicted as a 13th century or 14th century medieval king, is actually Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was tutored by Aristotle, the great philosopher. So here you see him tutoring him out of the book. But this scene shows a very different story from the life of Aristotle. Aristotle was madly in love with this woman, Phyllis, who was a younger woman, but she was a terrible person. And he said, "I'll do anything for you." And she said, "Okay, fine. Let me put a bridle in your mouth and I'll ride you around and you will be my horse." Which is this absolutely humiliating thing. But Aristotle did it. And here, looking through a window into this secret scene, is Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great held Aristotle in great awe and considered him to be the wisest of men. And yet here he is, totally being humiliated by this woman. So there's a little bit of a sexist overtone to this, and it's to watch out with those wily women. But it's also a remonstration that even the wisest can be laid low by their own folly. You see this theme all over the medieval world. And I love this example. This is an aquamanile. This is a fancy centerpiece. This is something you would put out for parties. And this is where people would get their water for the party when you had a big feast. And here it shows Aristotle. And here is Phyllis riding him, slapping his backside, holding onto his hair. It's just absolutely humiliating. So again, how do you read this from the perspective of somebody in the Middle Ages? Well, you read it by recognizing that it again is the story of inversion, this moral warning to watch yourself. And just like you would see bishops and monks in these judgment scenes wind up to hell, people in the Middle Ages knew that, the wheel of fortune turns and you never know quite where you're going to wind up. So much of what we consider to be Gothic eventually evolves into what we call the International Gothic, that we have this attenuated style, not exactly naturalistic perspective. 1 point mathematical perspective hadn't been invented yet, but we have a high degree of naturalism in the figures, and just a kind of loving quality of details to the drapery and long attenuated stylized figures. So much of what we think of as the early Renaissance, as in this example by Gentile da Fabriano in the Adoration of the Magi, actually owes its inspiration not to any kind of novel invention of the Renaissance, but really represents the continuity of the Middle Ages. The Renaissance is not quite so distinct as you would imagine. And that gets us probably to my last topic, which is the Renaissance itself. So why do we think of the Renaissance as different? And this is going to be really quick because I expect you're going to get this. If you ever take 2720, you'll get this from Steve or Courtney. Sometimes I teach 2720, but usually it's going to be Steve or Courtney, or sometimes Bob. And they're, going to be really... Bob is a medievalist. Bob teaches medieval and ancient stuff, but they have a heavier focus on the Renaissance. But I, as a medievalist, really understand that, the Renaissance is different, but it's not quite as different as we think. So where does the Renaissance come from? And I've said this before, but it bears repeating. It comes from this guy, Giorgio Vasari, who was an Italian architect and artist who was active in the middle of the 16th century. Yes, the 16th century. Not the 15th century in Italy when we think the Renaissance actually happened, but the 16th. And he had a patron who was Cosimo I. This was Cosimo I of Florence, who was a Medici. He was the grand-nephew, I think, of Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent. So this is a very important thing. This is during the time of the restoration of the Medicis. Long story short, the Medicis were the most powerful family in 15th century Florence, but they were deposed and later restored. And so this is the restoration of the Medicis. And he wrote a book called the Vitae, which is the lives of the artists. And it's in this book that he first creates the term the Renaissance, or the rebirth. And he's often known as the father of art history in the West. So The Lives of the Artists is such a fascinating book because it tells the story of artists from the 12th century to the time of Vasari's contemporaries. And it not only coins the term Renaissance, it emphasizes artists that were patronized by the Medici family. He has a very important narrative to tell. And the narrative he is telling is that once upon a time, art sucked. And then came the Medicis. And that's really the story he's telling, is that these very powerful Italian families, in particular the Medicis, were responsible for causing a revolution in art. A revolution that led to this rebirth. And all of the great glories of the Florence, Il Duomo, the cathedral, David, Botticelli, all of these things owe their inception, their origination to this change in style that happened by a particular set of notably Italian artists. He does talk about a few non-Italian artists, but his emphasis is on Italian artists, and particularly on Italian artists that were patronized by the Medici family. So he has an axe to grind. He has an agenda. There's no doubt about it. That's his agenda, is telling this story, is telling this story that art was crappy and then it wasn't. And the reason it wasn't was because of the Medicis and because of these Italian artists. So what does he mean when he means Renaissance? He means basically the rebirth of classicism. And he means this Renaissance as a revival of the cultures of ancient Greece and Rome. Naturalism, idealism, monumentality, classical orders, circular arches, those kind of things. Now, I've already proven to you that this is not really true. That the Gothic is at its core a Greco-Roman style of architecture. It uses the language of the Greco-Roman architecture, and it adds to it. And it's also true that the Middle Ages didn't lose naturalism entirely, and that they had been moving towards greater naturalism and greater classicism for centuries. So what are we talking about? So while he overstates his case, he basically is saying that this high refined point of classicism, like the Golden Ages is defined by Doryphorus or by the Prima Porta Augustus, were the things that inspires the Italian Renaissance. And there's a kind of truth to it. The Italian Renaissance is different from the High Middle Ages, not so much in technique or mastery of technique, but in an emphasis in tone. That when you do look at Michelangelo, as I demonstrated, Michelangelo isn't any more skilled artist than some of these medieval artists. What he does is he emphasizes the classicism, the historical classicism of the Greek and Roman Empire. He brings back classical nudes. He creates this David, and this David is such an interesting statue because the only thing that connects it to the story of David is the sling he's holding, and you can't even hardly see it. That he's really more of a representation of a classical deity like an Apollo, and he owes more of his inspiration to classical prefigures like these than he does to anything. And you can see the same thing in Raphael. Raphael will put vaulting into his paintings that's deliberately patterned on vaulting from things like the Basilica of Maxentius and classical works of architecture that were still standing in the time of the Renaissance. So it is this historicism, this classicism, that really sets apart the Renaissance. Not so much the monumentality, not so much the naturalism, but this particular focused naturalism that is a historical naturalism that's really trying to go back to the historical models. It's interesting that the first artist that Vasari starts with is going to be Giotto. Giotto is sometimes called Proto-Renaissance. And I think I've told you this before, that if there's ever a term in the universe that is a BS term, it's any term that begins with proto. Proto is one of these fudge words. In physics, if you don't know what something is, you call it dark. So hence dark energy or dark, matter. And the same thing exists in art history, except we call it proto. And what we mean by this is we see somebody who is going in the direction of the Renaissance. But you have to realize that Giotto was living in the 13th and 14th centuries. He didn't know the Renaissance was coming. The term Renaissance wouldn't even be coined until long after Leonardo and Botticelli were dead. So they didn't even use the term Renaissance, and they were clearly part of the Renaissance. But it shows the agenda that Vasari has, that Vasari wants to paint this story, that there is this rebirth in art, and that it is a uniquely Italian story, that it's unique to particularly his section, in his region of Italy. So let's evaluate this, and I hope you'll hang with me for a few minutes. This is our last lecture, so if you hang with me for just a few minutes, we go through this. And there is a certain amount of truth to this. And you can tell when you can compare Giotto to his master. Giotto came from humble origins, but he quickly became the student to Cimabue. Cimabue was a painter who was a master painting in what we call a Byzantine style. And when we look at it, you can see there is a pronounced difference between these two paintings. For one, notice how every one of the angels here You can clearly see their head sticking up above the next angel. It's all like they're standing on choir stalls. Every single one of them has a perfect three-quarter view, like they're doing their senior portrait. You know, but they look flat and dimensionless. There's all of this drapery on Mary, but it's outlined in gold. This is a technique we call chrysography. But in the end, Cimabue's Mary looks very flat, looks very dimensionless, and the figures look very stock. On the other side, however, on the Giotto, we see figures in profile, figures in three-quarter. You can see these angels. They overlap the angels behind, even to the point where they cut off the face of the people standing behind them. Don't you just hate that? You know, you're getting together for a group picture and somebody's halo cuts off your face. Ugh, I hate that. It used to happen at BYU all the time. Anyhow, but I mean, these different points of view, this overlapping, give this a depth. And look how he handles drapery. Instead of the chrysography, he instead gives us this high degree of modeling. When we look at the figure of Mary here, she has a lot more depth. She looks a lot more naturalistic. Same for the Christ child. And so we can see that there is this shift, this emphasis back to something more akin to classical traditions. So I'm not saying there isn't a change, but the change happens gradually. You can see this even more in some of the later works of Giotto. Here we have the Arena Chapel, also known as the Scrovegni Chapel. The Scrovegni was a family in Padua that had a private chapel, so they commissioned Giotto to do this. And here you see him creating this scene. And I love this scene because this is the scene of the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. This is the entry celebrated on Palm Sunday. And here you have Christ entering in Jerusalem, and the people are laying branches down in front of his feet, but they're also laying their cloaks in front of their feet. But my favorite detail is right here. That in addition to the overlapping here that makes this look more realistic, he has this poor guy pulling his cloak over his head. And he's kind of gotten stuck. How many times has that happened to you? How many times have you pulled a t-shirt over your head and you're like, and you have to work to get it off, or a sweater? That seems awkward. That seems something that you wouldn't put in there. It covers up his face and makes it seem awkward. But it's a way of bringing you into the picture. We see this also in the very famous scene of the Lamentation. Now, in this Lamentation, again, we have hands and halos overlapping faces, but notice the variety of expressions. They're not all the same three-quarter portrait. Some of them profile, some are turned more towards us. Some have contemplative expressions, some have hands thrown back in grief. The body of Christ is laid out there. Mary has this kind of intimacy, being very close to him. And then you have this guy with his back to you. I want you to think just how strange that really is. If your back is to you, you can't see them. And he's actually obscuring the view of Christ's body and his wounds, making it harder to see. This is not something somebody in the Middle Ages would have done. But because this person's back is to you, it allows you access into this picture. It makes you feel like you're part of a crowd instead of just looking at a picture. And then, of course, it has this very naturalistic drapery. And so we have a big question here to ask. Are these innovations by Giotto, these innovations that we call Proto-Renaissance, that will ultimately lead to what we call the Renaissance, are they rightly termed Proto-Renaissance? Or would they be better termed as Gothic or late Gothic? Because we see a lot of things that Gothic was already moving in this direction. Well, that's a fight for the ages. And I've discovered that the way you come down on that fight is basically whether you're hung up on the Renaissance as a thing or not. If you're a scholar who was taught in the Renaissance, this is Proto-Renaissance. But if you're a medievalist, this is late Gothic. I hope to basically, the message I'm giving you about the Renaissance is that if there was a rebirth, and I think there's good evidence that there was a kind of historical, a kind of trend towards classical historicism in the Italian Renaissance. The North is much more complicated. But at least in Italy, there was this kind of historicism that was revived. So yeah, there was a rebirth, but, the labor lasted 300 years and took a very long time, and owes a lot of it to the innovation of the Gothic and the late Middle Ages. All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, that is the class. That is it. Thanks for all the comments down in the discussions, and I hope you have a great summer. Okay, bye-bye.